What happens when a McDonald's worker refuses to serve Donald Trump? In a moment that shocks everyone, a young man stands up for what's right against one of the most powerful figures in the world. The unexpected twist? Both leave with respect. You won't believe what happens next. It was just another busy afternoon at the McDonald's restaurant in downtown New York City. The usual hustle and bustle filled the air as customers streamed in for their lunch breaks. The sizzling sound of burgers on the grill, the clinking of trays being stacked and moved, and the steady chatter of conversations created the familiar soundtrack of an ordinary workday. Behind the counter, Jake, a 25-year-old McDonald's worker, was right in the middle of the action. He was busy taking orders, flipping patties, and managing the cash register like he had done countless times before. Jake wasn't just another employee. He was someone with big dreams, someone who had plans beyond the counter of McDonald's. He had been working there for over 2 years, saving up for his college tuition while juggling the demands of the fast food industry. His passion for politics was what truly kept him going. He hoped to one day work in the political arena, using his voice and knowledge to create meaningful change. But for now, working at McDonald's was the reality, and he did it with professionalism and determination. Every day, he made sure to offer the best service possible, treating each customer with respect, no matter who they were. He understood that being behind the counter was just a stepping stone to something greater. Most days at McDonald's were predictable. The customers came in, placed their orders, and Jake moved efficiently from one task to the next. But there were some days when something unexpected would happen, something that would break the monotony and turn an ordinary shift into a story worth telling. Jake had never known that today would be one of those days. It had started like any other. The lunch rush had begun to settle down, the usual after-lunch lull in activity, filling the restaurant with a quieter, calmer atmosphere. Jake was taking a breather, wiping down the counter when he heard the door to the restaurant swing open. He glanced up, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was just another group of customers, probably a few business people or tourists, grabbing a quick bite before heading back to their offices. He kept his focus on his work, but something about the sudden hush in the room caught his attention. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and before he knew it, a group of people walked in. Jake barely had a chance to take it all in before he noticed something unusual. The security detail trailing behind the group immediately caught his eye. The men were dressed in suits, their expressions serious and alert. They stood out in stark contrast to the everyday lunch crowd, which was made up of people simply trying to grab a meal. Jake's eyes widened in disbelief as he quickly realized who was walking toward him. It wasn't just any group of customers. Standing right before him, towering over the counter, was none other than Donald Trump, the former president of the United States. The realization hit Jake like a freight train. He froze for a second, unsure if what he was seeing was real. His mind raced, trying to process the situation. Could this really be happening? The former president was dressed in his usual dark suit, a red tie hanging loosely around his neck. His hair, as usual, was styled in a distinct, well-known fashion. Jake's hands instinctively tightened around the counter, trying to maintain his composure. The restaurant was suddenly quiet. All the noise from the busy lunch rush had ceased. It felt like the world had slowed down, and for a moment it was as if Jake and Trump were the only two people in the room. Behind Trump, his security team moved efficiently, scanning the restaurant for potential threats. The presence of the security guards only reinforced that this wasn't an ordinary visit. They were on high alert, walking with precision, but Trump himself seemed calm and unbothered by the attention. He casually walked up to the counter where Jake was standing, offering a smile as he approached. It was the kind of smile that Jake had seen countless times on television, but now it was happening right in front of him, in the very McDonald's where he worked. Jake stood there for a split second, his mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to take a deep breath and focus. He had faced all kinds of customers in his time working at McDonald's, from disgruntled patrons to families with kids running wild, but nothing had prepared him for this. Here he was, standing face to face with a man who had once been the most powerful leader in the world. "Hi, I'll have the usual," Trump said, his voice calm and even. He looked directly at Jake, as if he had been to this particular McDonald's 100 times before. It was the kind of request you might expect from a regular customer. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. Jake, still in shock, blinked. His mind struggled to catch up with the reality of the situation. What did he even mean by the usual? Did it mean a Big Mac? Fries? Jake couldn't be sure, but it was clear that the former president was treating this like just another fast food stop. His expression remained friendly, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation was different, more significant, more surreal. Jake quickly glanced at his fellow employees, all of whom had also stopped working to witness the moment. Some of them were trying to hide their shock, while others just stared, their mouths hanging open. It was a surreal sight to behold. Donald Trump in the middle of a McDonald's, about to place a simple order like any other customer. But Jake wasn't just any employee, and this wasn't going to be just another routine order. Something told him this was going to be a lot more than that. "Hi, I'll have the usual," Trump said with a smile, his voice smooth and confident, clearly expecting the staff to recognize him and immediately cater to his request. His tone was casual, as if this were just another stop on his busy day, a quick bite to eat in the middle of a whirlwind schedule. But Jake couldn't ignore the surreal nature of the moment. It wasn't every day that a former president walked into his McDonald's, let alone one with the amount of fame and controversy that Trump carried. Jake stood frozen for a moment, staring at the man in front of him. His heart raced, his mind went blank, and his hands began to sweat. The sudden realization of who he was talking to hit him like a ton of bricks. He had seen Trump on TV countless times, listened to his speeches, and followed his rise in politics. But now he was here, standing right in front of Jake, ordering a McDonald's meal as though he were just any other customer. For a brief second, Jake's mind raced. Should he treat this like any other order? Should he act as if this were just another celebrity or public figure? But then Jake caught himself. He wasn't starstruck, and he wasn't the type of person to let a celebrity or a powerful figure intimidate him. He had met all kinds of people working at McDonald's, business people, tourists, and even the occasional local celebrity. But none of them had the impact that Trump's presence had on him. This wasn't just any customer, after all. This was a man who had led the country, a figure who had shaped the course of history and sparked intense debates. He wasn't just a former president, he was someone who had made waves in business, media, and politics, for better or for worse. And now he was standing in Jake's McDonald's, asking for the usual, expecting to be served without any hassle. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Jake took a deep breath and reminded himself of the most important thing. He was still at work, and it was his job to provide the same service to every customer, no matter who they were. He had always prided himself on doing his job to the best of his ability, and that meant treating everyone equally. Trump was just another customer, in Jake's mind, someone who happened to be a lot more well-known than most. But that didn't change the fact that Jake had a responsibility to provide a good experience for anyone who walked through those doors. "Of course, Mr. Trump," Jake replied, his voice steady, though his hands were still a little shaky. He tried to keep his composure, but something inside him stirred. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but there was a nagging feeling in his gut that told him this was no ordinary transaction. Trump's presence, his reputation, the sheer weight of his legacy. It felt like it was going to be more than just a simple order. Jake took another deep breath, his mind warring between what he had been taught and what he felt was right. He glanced down at the register, ready to begin processing the order, but something inside him made him hesitate. He couldn't just ignore the unease he felt. His gut told him to act on his instincts, to not let the situation pass by without addressing it in a meaningful way. Instead of immediately getting to work, Jake made a conscious decision. He looked Trump squarely in the eye, and for a split second, he saw the former president's gaze soften as he waited for Jake to do his job. But Jake knew that this wasn't a moment for routine, for simply following the script. This was a moment where he had to stand firm, where his beliefs had to matter more than any fear or hesitation. So, after a brief pause, Jake straightened up, looked Trump in the eye, and said, "Actually, Mr. Trump, I'm afraid I can't take your order." The words left his mouth before he had fully processed the gravity of what he was saying. His heart skipped a beat. He could feel the entire room go silent. The air seemed to thicken as the other employees froze in their tracks, eyes wide with disbelief. The customers around the counter stopped what they were doing, their attention riveted on the interaction taking place. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time itself had come to a standstill. Jake's statement hung in the air like a heavy weight, and the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The usual background noise, the clatter of trays, the hum of conversation, faded away, replaced by the sound of Jake's words echoing in the quiet space. This wasn't just an ordinary exchange, it was a moment of tension, a moment where something extraordinary had just happened. Jake had refused to serve one of the most famous men in the world, and no one knew what would happen next. The uncertainty of the situation pressed down on him, but Jake stood tall, resolute. He had said what he believed even though he couldn't yet predict the consequences. The eyes of everyone in the room were on him now, waiting for a response from Trump, waiting for something to break the silence. It felt like the entire world was watching, waiting for the former president to either react with anger or frustration, or to do something unexpected. No one could have predicted what would come next. Jake's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and the room fell into a stillness that was almost suffocating. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him from all sides. Every eye in the restaurant was on him, all waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. He stood perfectly still, his hands gripping the counter as though it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his expression remained calm, even resolute. Trump's reaction came almost immediately. He raised an eyebrow, a clear sign of surprise, perhaps even confusion. It wasn't often that someone had the courage, or the audacity, to refuse him. But Jake hadn't hesitated. He wasn't going to let the gravity of the moment, or the man in front of him, sway his resolve. "Excuse me?" Trump said, his voice polite but laced with an unmistakable hint of confusion. His demeanor was still controlled, but there was a flicker in his eyes that told Jake this wasn't a usual interaction for him. Jake could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. But he wasn't backing down now. This was a moment that would define him, whether he liked it or not. He cleared his throat, willing his voice to remain steady. "Mr. Trump, it's not personal," he said, his words clear and deliberate. "I just believe that your actions have affected many people in this country in ways that I can't ignore. I'm here to do my job, but I can't pretend that everything is okay. It's about standing up for what's right. It's about not letting power, influence, or status dictate how we treat others." Jake's words rang out in the quiet room, shocking not just Trump but everyone else present. The restaurant, which had been filled with the noise of clattering trays and murmured conversations only moments before, was now eerily silent. People were looking at each other, exchanging puzzled glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. A McDonald's worker, one who was typically invisible in the background of the fast food world, had just made a bold stand. And not just any stand, but one that challenged the very fabric of power and influence that so many took for granted. For a moment, Jake thought he might have overstepped. He thought perhaps the room would explode with anger, or maybe Trump would lash out, dismissing him with a sharp retort. But instead, the silence continued, hanging between them like a fragile thread. Jake stood his ground, not out of defiance but out of conviction. He wasn't trying to make a scene. He was simply stating what he believed to be true, even if it was uncomfortable or unpopular. He knew that his role as a McDonald's worker did not diminish his ability to voice his thoughts, to have an opinion, to stand up for what he felt was right. Trump stood there for what felt like an eternity, his gaze fixed on Jake. Jake couldn't tell what was going on in the former president's mind. Was he angry? Offended? Was he considering what Jake had said? The uncertainty made Jake's pulse quicken. He just told one of the most powerful men in the world that he couldn't take his order, and not just because of some trivial reason, but because of the impact that Trump's actions had on the people of this country. Then, as though the weight of the moment had settled into Trump's mind, something flickered in his eyes. A shift, an almost imperceptible change. It wasn't anger, as Jake had feared, nor was it the icy dismissal he had expected. Instead, it was something far more complex. It was a look of understanding, maybe even respect. Trump took a step back, giving Jake a long, measured look. His expression softened, and after a beat, he nodded. "I understand where you're coming from," he said, his voice no longer tinged with confusion, but with a trace of appreciation. "It's important to stand by what you believe in. I respect that." Jake wasn't sure what to make of the response. Trump hadn't stormed out or made a scene, which was a relief. But more than that, Jake realized that the moment wasn't about him winning or losing an argument. It was about creating space for people to express themselves, to challenge the status quo, and to make their voices heard. In a world where people often felt powerless, Jake had found his voice, and he had used it. The exchange seemed to catch the attention of the other customers as well. Several of them, who had been quietly watching now, began to murmur among themselves, their whispers mixed with a sense of admiration for Jake's courage. It was an unusual turn of events, an ordinary McDonald's worker standing up to a figure like Trump. But it was a moment that spoke to something much bigger. It was about the power of conviction, about standing up for what was right, no matter who was watching. For Jake, the moment felt like a small victory. He didn't know if Trump would ever change or if his words would make a difference in the grand scheme of things. But in that instant, Jake felt something profound, that it wasn't just the people in positions of power who had the ability to change things. It was everyone. It was the worker behind the counter, the student sitting in class, the everyday person who had the courage to stand firm in their beliefs, even when it seemed like the world was telling them to stay quiet. As the silence in the room slowly began to dissipate, the reality of what had just transpired began to settle in. Jake had made his stand, and while he wasn't sure what the future held, he knew one thing for certain. He had taken a step towards something much bigger than a simple order at McDonald's. He had shown that no matter who you are, your voice matters. And sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest impact. Jake, still unsure of how the situation would unfold, glanced back at the register, his mind spinning with the implications of what had just happened. He had expected a sharp retort, anger, or maybe even a confrontation from Trump. After all, he had just refused to take an order from one of the most powerful men in the world, a man whose name was synonymous with controversy and influence. The moment was charged with tension, and Jake's heart still raced. But to his surprise, there was no explosion of anger. Instead, a strange calm seemed to settle over the room. The air, which had once been thick with anticipation, now felt almost neutral, as if a shift had taken place, one that neither Jake nor Trump had expected. The restaurant's atmosphere had changed, from one of uneasy silence to one of contemplation. People who had been watching, waiting for something dramatic to unfold, began to exchange glances. Some of them nodded in subtle agreement with Jake's words, a few even offering small, appreciative smiles. It was as though they too were processing the moment. Trump stood motionless for a few seconds, and his security detail, which had been alert and poised for action just moments before, remained oddly still, allowing the situation to take its course. Their silence was almost as surprising as Trump's reaction. For the first time in a long while, the restaurant felt like it was in a state of neutrality. There was no tension hanging in the air, no clear side to take, just the shared weight of the encounter settling over everyone. Trump then took a small step forward, his expression shifting. The stern look he had worn earlier softened, and his eyes seemed to reflect a deeper understanding. He looked directly at Jake, his face more relaxed than before. "You know," Trump said, his voice lower and more reflective than it had been, "it's not often that I encounter someone willing to speak their mind like that." His words were measured, and for the first time they didn't carry the usual force or bravado. "I may not agree with everything you said, but I appreciate your honesty." Jake stood there, taken aback. This wasn't the response he had expected. There was no anger, no insult, no attempt to belittle him for making such a bold stand. Instead, Trump's words were calm, almost respectful. The moment felt like an odd acknowledgement of Jake's courage, of his willingness to challenge the status quo, regardless of who stood in front of him. Jake couldn't quite grasp the significance of what was happening, but he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. This wasn't going the way he had imagined at all. The atmosphere in the restaurant, which had been thick with tension, began to ease. People who had been holding their breath now seemed to relax, as though they were witnessing something unexpected and perhaps even transformative. It wasn't every day that someone took a stand in such a public way, and even fewer times did that stand result in understanding rather than conflict. Then, in an unexpected turn, Trump did something that truly surprised everyone in the room. He took a step back, gestured to his security team, and said, "You know what, I think we'll head out for lunch elsewhere. It's been a long day." His words were casual, but they carried an air of finality. The staff, who had been waiting anxiously for the next move, were left momentarily speechless. Rather than making a scene, rather than storming out in anger or demanding to be served, Trump simply smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine, something rare to see from a man who had spent years in the spotlight. As he turned to leave, he raised his hand in a friendly wave to the staff, who were still recovering from the shock of the encounter. The wave wasn't just a gesture of politeness, it felt like a symbol of mutual understanding. The room collectively exhaled. The tension that had filled the space just moments ago seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of calm. The customers, many of whom had been nervously watching the interaction, now breathed a collective sigh of relief. There were a few murmurs of approval, and the staff returned to their tasks, albeit with a new energy in the air. It was clear that something significant had just happened, though its full impact wouldn't be immediately understood. Jake, still processing the unexpected shift, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had expected an angry outburst or a confrontation, but instead he had received something far more powerful: respect. Trump had acknowledged Jake's courage and his right to speak his mind, even if their views didn't align. In that moment, Jake realized that he had not only stood up for what he believed in, but had also shown the power of honest dialogue. Even the most unexpected encounters, those that seemed destined for conflict, could end in understanding, if approached with respect. As the door swung closed behind Trump and his security team, Jake stood there for a moment, reflecting on what had just occurred. The world outside the walls of McDonald's might have been full of division and discord, but here, in this small restaurant, a conversation had taken place, one that left both sides with a sense of dignity and, strangely enough, mutual respect. For Jake, the day had started like any other, but it would end as something unforgettable. He had learned that standing up for what you believe in didn't always lead to confrontation. It sometimes led to an unexpected turn of events, where even the most unlikely people could find common ground. The moment had been a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the encounter came to a close, the restaurant began to slowly return to its usual rhythm. The buzz of activity that had been briefly interrupted by the tension in the air was now starting to fill the space again. The clinking of trays, the sizzle of fries being dropped into the fryer, and the familiar murmur of customers chatting in line. It all began to feel normal again. But Jake, as he went back to his duties, couldn't help but notice that the atmosphere had shifted. The air was different somehow. The space felt lighter, more charged with a subtle sense of respect and reflection. Jake's mind was still processing everything that had happened. The intense silence, the words exchanged, the surprising calm from Trump, it all felt surreal. But Jake was proud of himself. He had done something he didn't expect to do, something that took more courage than he realized at the time. He had spoken his truth in the face of someone who had the power to overshadow him. What had started as a tense confrontation had turned into a moment of mutual respect. Both sides had walked away with something more than they had come with. Jake had shown his bravery and principles, and Trump had, in his own way, acknowledged that courage. Jake had made a statement, and it wasn't just about politics. It was about standing up for what's right. It was about showing the world that your voice matters, regardless of who you are or where you come from. He had proven that, even in the most unlikely of situations, anyone could make a difference if they had the strength to speak up. He didn't have to be a politician or a celebrity to make a point. Sometimes it was the everyday people, the ones who worked behind counters or in offices or on the streets, who had the most power to inspire change. He had shown that everyone, whether they were a McDonald's worker or a former president, had the ability to use their voice to make an impact. No matter how small or seemingly insignificant, every voice counts. And in this case, Jake's voice had been heard. He had taken a risk, not for fame or recognition, but because he believed in something greater than himself. The idea that standing up for your beliefs, even in the face of uncertainty, was worth the risk. On the other hand, Donald Trump, though he may not have agreed with Jake's reasons or his stance, left the encounter with a newfound respect for the young man. The moment had shown Trump that there was strength in standing firm on your beliefs, no matter who you were. He may not have shared Jake's views, but he could still appreciate the courage it took to speak out, especially in such an unexpected setting. It wasn't often that people were willing to challenge him directly, especially not in a place as casual as a McDonald's. But Jake had done so, and that, in itself, was powerful. Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He wasn't looking for applause or accolades. He had simply acted on his principles. The moment was a reminder to him that no matter how small or big the stage, what truly mattered was staying true to yourself and your beliefs. The most impactful moments weren't always planned or scripted. Sometimes they came from a spontaneous act of courage. The moral of the story was clear. No matter where you come from or what job you do, your voice matters. Whether you're serving burgers at McDonald's or leading a country, you have the power to make a difference. Standing up for what you believe in, even when faced with uncertainty, can inspire others and create change. And in the end, both Jake and Trump left that day with a sense of dignity. They each knew that they had made a powerful impact in their own way, Jake by challenging the status quo, and Trump by recognizing the strength in someone standing firm, regardless of their position. Both had learned something, and in that simple exchange, a small but meaningful change had taken place.